Hello and welcome to the epilogue of my Musargon project with a rough sketch of history. I just like to end with a few final thoughts and also some thanks. First of all, I'd like to thank you for listening to this. This was a much bigger project than I ever thought it would be. It initially was planned out to be three 20-minute episodes, maybe only two 30-minute or maybe two 20-minute episodes. It became much larger than that, but I'm glad that I did it. I'm not under any illusions that this is watched or going to be watched by a lot of people, but I mostly did this for myself, and I wanted to share what I found with anyone who would be interested. So again, I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank my wife, that she was very supportive of this, supportive of the time that it took to do the research, to do the recordings, writing the scripts. We have young kids and things are very busy, and I appreciate her being supportive of me taking the time to do this. I wish I could cite all of the sources that I used. I wish I was more methodical about keeping track, but I can certainly list the big ones. First of all, Edward Langell, the author of To Conquer Hell, his a speech that he gave, or a presentation along with this book, was the inspiration for this project. To want to learn more, I talked about him, I believe, in the first introduction. But also the National World War I Museum and Memorial in St. Louis, Missouri. Or not St. Louis, Missouri, sorry, Kansas City, Missouri, which is always confusing to me, Kansas City, Missouri. They have a huge library of recorded lectures on YouTube, and that was not only helpful in finding information, but it was also, as again, it's the inspiration for this project, was listening to one of those lectures by Edward Langell. I hope I'm saying his name right. But other books that were very helpful along with those lecture series, A World Undone by J.G. Meyer, which is the First World War by Martin Gilbert. Let's see. And The Guns of August by. And now why am I failing on her name? Barbara Tuchman. I'll need to check on that. I think it's The Guns of August is the name of the book, and the author is Barbara Tubman, I think. I apologize if I got that name wrong, but the book is definitely The Guns of August. Those were all very helpful sources, along with things that I got from the Battlefield Monuments, National Battlefield Monuments Committee. Information I was able to access through the website of the National Cemetery at the Musargon. Again, many resources. Like I said, if this was a more official project, I would have done a better job of citing those. But if there was anything that anyone wanted me to look into, you can either, if you know me personally, contact me personally. If you know if this is just something you're finding on YouTube, put something in the comments, and I'll try to find whatever specific fact or information and track down where I got that from. Again, if you have questions about things in general, whether you know me or whether you don't, contact me in whatever is the easiest way. So those with thanks, and then just to kind of take things out a little bit from the end of the battle. As I said before, the battle ended the same day the war ended. And as I talked about before, the goal of this battle was to cause a collapse of the German army in Belgium and France. It turned out the army collapsed anyway without the capturing of Sedan, mostly just because the German army was just spent. Both supplies, food, manpower, it could no longer field. It could no longer resist the Allies. An important little side note on that a piece of propaganda that was picked up later in history, and even today in some circles gets circulated around a little bit, which was that the German army left France in good order. It plays into the Nazis' stabbed in the back theory, that the German army was lost because it wasn't supported at home. And that is just undeniably not true. That the World War I ended the way that most wars in history tend to end. They don't tend to end with the complete annihilation or defeat of one side. The Second World War is kind of an anomaly in that sense. And in fact, that the leaders of Germany spared the German populace a horrendous battle had they decided they were going to fight all the way to the end and force the Western Allies to push all the way to Berlin to end the war. They would have eventually done that. In fact, they were building what was known as Plan 1919, year 1919, that was going to be the big offensive, that they were going to dive into Germany. With, again, a little bit of a side note, that is not a correct thing. If you ever come across anyone any books or any persons trying to push that theory, that somehow that Germany was stabbed in the back by its own populace is not true. The German civilian population suffered immensely during the war to keep that army in the field. But aside from that, again, we talked about that the Meuse-Argonne was going to be pivotal in ending the war, which in turn would be the war to end all wars, to launch a new era of peace and prosperity across the globe. And that's something that can get a little bit of derision or mocking today. But again, that's not, as I said before, it's not very fair. This was something that they had never seen before. No one in history had seen a war at this scale. And, at this, both in the effect of it and how much of the globe it affected, but also, the numbers of people involved. Excuse me, the number of nations involved. It was reasonable to believe that this would change things. And in fact, it did change things. It just didn't result in no more wars happening. In fact, it almost all but guaranteed a second war. In fact, and I want to say that it was the British Foreign Secretary. Sorry, I'm just doing this off the cuff. I'm not researching this last one, but there is a quote that when shown the ending agreements of the Versailles Treaty, I think it was the British Foreign Secretary that marked, this isn't a peace treaty, this is a 20-year armistice. That we were setting ourselves up for another war because they were putting demands on Germany that no nation would tolerate. The only reason Germany was tolerating it in 1918, 1919 is because they had no choice, but it wouldn't always be that way. Woodrow Wilson's grand goals of restructuring the international system, creating a deliberative body for diplomacy, all of these things happened in half measures that weren't effective. But I don't want to dismiss this as pointless, because I think a lot of times people look at the First World War and say it was all pointless. and it wasn't. It did change a lot of the world, and I will go into some of those changes here. But beyond that, when Henry Truman was sworn in as president after Roosevelt died, he specifically requested to be sworn in under the portrait of Woodrow Wilson, because he knew that he would be that Roosevelt was the president of the war, he would be the president of the peace. And much of the post-World War II system that was put in place, the post-war system, was structured around not exactly the same plans, but the same concepts that Woodrow Wilson and his 14 points were pushing. And it actually worked remarkably well. You could argue that, no major power has gone to war with another major power for any real extended time frame since the Second World War. There's been lots of wars, to be sure, and it certainly seems like that we live in a world of turmoil. But if you actually look at just from a data perspective, that the number of people who die in armed conflicts has been steadily dropping since the Second World War and the period afterwards. Yes, there are wars all over the world, but this system has been effective. And, we also are pushing a period now of well over 70 years since the Second World War. And, as I talked before, that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And I think nothing lasts forever. And, it has been humans' history to have these great wars from time to time. And what I suspect will happen, whether in our lifetime or the next or the one after, people will become farther and farther away from the rules and understandings of the idea of why the international system was set up in a certain way. The same way that Europe came up with a system after the Napoleonic Wars to keep that from happening again. And about 100 years later, generations removed, people didn't, that system was not relevant in a newer, in a new world, and people forgot or didn't appreciate why the system was there, or didn't value it. And then we have the First World War, and again, extending all the way to the Second World War, and we will probably have a similar thing, that the systems that we established to keep the peace after the First or the Second World War will eventually either be forgotten, not utilized properly, or become irrelevant. And it's sad to say that human nature, there probably will be another, large international war, or world, global spanning war. I guess let's hope it's not in our lifetime. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this will be a pivotal shift in human history. We have altered course on other things before, so we'll see. So again, the war did matter. It did matter in its consequences and how we adopted policies later. It also just mattered in how it changed the world. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Habsburgs, they'd been there for hundreds of years, gone. The Romanovs in Russia, hundreds of years dynasty, gone. The German Empire, the German monarchy, gone. Indirectly, within the next ensuing years, the Italian monarchy, gone. We see the rise of Japan as a modern power with influence on the international stage. Britain's economic dominance of the world is starting to slip and being outpaced by the United States. The rise of the United States as an economic power. Everything that we know of the world today, this is where it all began. There was a huge shift in the world before 1914 and the world after 1918, and we are living in a post-1918 world. That old world we have very little connection to, a direct connection. The end of colonialism was the end of after the First World War, that began to sow the seeds that would later end with colonialism, transitioning to a different state, but certainly not in the way that it was pre-World War One. You know, the big things that we know of the world have their roots here. Look at the conflicts today. Afghanistan, the difficulties with ISIS in Syria and Iraq, maybe not Libya directly, but definitely the conflicts in Ukraine. All of this stuff is you can draw straight lines back to things set in motion during or directly after the First World War. As I talked before, the state of the role the United States plays both militarily and diplomatically in the world stage is a product of the First World War. The United States didn't really meddle much in European affairs, not in a big way, until the First World War. We kind of viewed the whole other half of the planet as not really worth paying too much attention to. But, you know, it became clearer and clearer that in a modern world, the world was getting smaller. We couldn't simply do our own thing and not be affected by outside forces. The modern U.S. military was created in the First World War. You know, I think I could say it was, okay, this is just opinion, but I believe that the army that went to war in the Second World War, that achieved so much success in defeating the Nazis and the Japanese Empire and the other Axis powers, couldn't have existed without the lessons learned in the Meuse-Argonne and preparing and running the First World War. General Marshall of the Marshall Plan, who is credited with stabilizing or helping to stabilize Europe after the Second World War. He was one of the lead generals of the logistical operations of the First World War. This is where he learned how supplies could get moved from place to place, how to organize. General Patton was commanding tanks in the First World War, where he, from that point on, shifted his mind from cavalry to tanks being the centerpiece of what he believed warfare refocused. Douglas MacArthur, Harry Truman, as we mentioned before, was an artillery officer in the First World War. General Eisenhower did not fight directly in the war, but was tasked after the war with doing an assessment of the Battle of in the Meuse-Argonne to determine kind of what went right, what went wrong. All of these men went on to be pivotal roles in what the U.S. military would be. But beyond that, the doctrine, the idea of what the U.S. military, how it would function in modern world coalesced at this point. And as I said before, the United States is a firepower-based army. I don't say this to downplay the individual skill or training or motivation of the soldiers of the U.S. Armed Forces, but how wars are won from a U.S. perspective is technologically advanced weaponry, a lot of it, and lots of supplies to back it up. The U.S. Army is not an army that treads lightly, and that led to in the Second World War, as opposed to in the First World War, when there were chronic shortages of weapons, ammunition, food. The Second World War did not have this issue, and subsequent wars we've had, generally American soldiers have had everything that they needed and more from a supplies perspective. That's the idea, as Napoleon said, army marches on its stomach. And the United States has really taken to that theory that an army that wins wars is an army that can bring a lot of firepower to the field and sustain it for a long time. And that it doesn't really matter um, if you are braver or more motivated than your force, you cannot overcome firepower. And again, as I've said before, the idea being that once firepower is in place, once supplies is in place, that's when motivated, trained, and competent soldiers can win the day. But they can't do it without these things. Not in a world where weapons can be manufactured at a huge scale that are destructive beyond anything that a 19th century general could comprehend. So the ideas of the clever maneuvers is not nearly as important as to use an army term, to be there the first and with the most. So again, the U.S. Army in its current state is a product of the lessons learned of the Musargon. So yeah, I've kind of gone on, but these are all different things that it had an actual and real impact in our world. And beyond that, in a more ephemeral way that's not directly connected to current days, I think that it's important to learn about things that happened not only as tools, for us to understand and make decisions going forward, but also I think in a sense of memorializing and respect. That, as I've said before, the Musargon was the largest battle the U.S. ever fought. There were thousands upon thousands of Americans that died in France, and we should remember them, I guess, is how I feel. If for no other reason, that I think that we will want to be remembered. That today, that the soldiers who have fought in Iraq and Afghanistan and other places, that as a nation, I think we owe their sacrifice, if nothing else, simply not to forget that they did it. So that's a very important aspect to me, and that's part of, again, why this project mattered to me. So with that, I could probably just talk and go around in circles, so I should probably just wrap it up. But again, I thank you all. I hope this was helpful, and if anyone would like further information, please don't hesitate to reach out to me.